Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. And I changed the title of my talk slightly, but it's still basically about the same thing. So I'll be talking about localization physics and actually, if I have time, 2 different experiments, both using kicked quantum gases. So the first thing I want to talk about is an experimental realization of an interacting many-body quantum kicked rotor and a study of many-body dynamical localization or delocalization in this, this new system. And then if we have time, I want to talk about another kicked system, which is in some ways even more complex, which is a kicked quasi-crystal, and talk about real space localization in that. But first, the quantum kicked rotor. And I've skipped for this talk all the introductory motivation trying to convince you that kicked quantum matter is interesting and quantum dynamics are interesting, because I think that given the purpose of this workshop, these are topics that people here are generally interested in already. So here I'm just going to jump right in and introduce the quantum kicked rotor, which is really a prototype of chaos. And it's a prototype of the differences between classical and quantum chaos in particular. So this is a very simple system. Classically, you can think about it as just a kicked particle on a ring. It has some kinetic energy, and it has some periodically pulsed kicking energy here. And if it's a classical system, it makes a transition from non-chaotic to chaotic behavior as a function of the strength of this kick parameter. And when that strength is around 1, you see diffusive heating and linear time energy growth. The physics of a quantum version of the system is completely different. There's just really no mapping between these two. And in a quantum kicked rotor, you see very generically ergodicity breaking, you see localization at finite energy, and you do not see this long time diffusive heating. And it was understood by Shmuel-Fishman and collaborators early on that there's a mapping between the dynamical localization that we see in a kicked rotor and Anderson localization in momentum space. And this is not a new topic for cold atomic physics. I'm a cold atom physicist, by the way. So people in my field have been studying this for more than a quarter of a century. And actually some of the earliest optical lattice quantum simulation work was performed on this model by Mark Raisin and other groups in the 1990s. So this is something that's been thought about theoretically and experimentally for decades. But what has remained unexplored, and what I want to talk about today, at least unexplored experimentally, is the question of many-body effects in this quantum kicked rotor. What if instead of a single particle, you have 100,000 kicked rotors which can interact with each other? How does this change things? And this is a project that was really inspired by discussion and collaboration with Victor Galitsky, who's pictured at the lower right. He visited Santa Barbara slightly before the pandemic, and we started to talk about this, and now it's a full-fledged project. So that's been a very rewarding collaboration. And the physical realization that we came up with of a many-body interacting quantum kicked rotor is very simple. It's just a Bose condensate of lithium-7, which is an atom that has a good Feshbach resonance, so we can tune interactions between the particles arbitrarily. And we take this Bose condensate and we put it in an optical lattice that we can pulse periodically. I want to mention also that the group of Deep Gupta at the University of Washington has been doing some complementary investigations, and it's been a lot of fun talking to Deep's group. They have results that are similar to what we see here, but in a somewhat different regime. So both of these results should be published soon. And this, with both Victor and Deep, it's been a very nice collaboration for us. So starting in a simple regime, we can turn off interactions by going to a 0 crossing of the Feshbach resonance. And in this regime, we just have a single particle kicked rotor with a BEC and a lattice. And in this non-interacting regime, it's very straightforward to observe localization. So I'm showing here a sequence of images of the BEC taken in momentum space as a function of kick number on the x-axis. And you can see as we start from 0 kicks and kick more, you get occupation of higher momentum modes. The energy of the system grows. But then at some point after just a few kicks, 5 or 6 kicks, it stops growing and nothing changes for a long time. And this is very generic behavior and sort of a clear signature. This is very different than what you would expect. Classically, we're in a chaotic regime. So this is a regime where classically the atoms would heat diffusively up to infinite temperature. And here, in fact, we see they completely break ergodicity and just localize. It is possible to recover something that looks like that classical behavior using a trick. So if instead of kicking regularly, kick, 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 we randomly modulate the period between kicks, so the kicks come at random times, actually this destroys the localization physics in the quantum system. And if we do that, you get something that looks like what's shown on this graph here. So the data from the previous slide are the red dots that shows that the energy, which is the y-axis here, stops growing after just a few kicks and saturates to a plateau. If instead we kick randomly, we see that the energy increases roughly linearly in time. So we can sort of fake classical mechanics here using random kicking. And we understand this localization very well, and people have understood it before us as well. So our non-interacting data show very good agreement with non-interacting single particle theory. And that's all that's shown here is the plateau level you reach. Here I'm plotting momentum instead of energy. The plateau level you reach is controlled by the kicking strength and is well matched by non-interacting theory.
So I interrupt you shortly. There is a question, and the question is the kick in the uniform amplitude of the optical periodic potential?
Yes, good question. Yes. So what we're doing here physically is most of the time the atoms are just a BEC sitting in free space, and we pulse on the lattice. So the lattice is usually not on at all. It's only on during these very brief kicks. So we're changing the amplitude of the lattice from 0 to something finite with a sort of delta function like train. And these different plateaus here are for different strengths of that amplitude kick. Thanks for the question. All right, this is well understood physics so far. So the new ingredient here is to add interactions. So with lithium-7, we can use a Feshbach resonance to tune the contact interactions among the 100,000 or so particles involved in these experiments. And you could imagine a few things happen. You could imagine we see some sort of dynamical version of many-body localization. You could imagine we see pre-thermal dynamics. And you could imagine we see delocalization, which could be subdiffusive in character. There's been a good bit of theory work on this. But it's actually a little bit unclear what the right theoretical tool is to examine this kind of system. So this motivates our experiments. So what happens if we go from this non-interacting experiment to an interacting one? Well, I'm showing here the momentum distribution as a function of kick number, now up to much larger kicks, up to 1,000 kicks here, much larger kick numbers. And what you're seeing here is a localized sample. In a non-interacting case, we first populate a few momentum modes and then kind of nothing changes at large kick numbers. If we turn on interactions, we see different behavior. So this is the same measurement, but for a sample where we've changed the magnetic field to vary the interactions between the atoms. And you can see with your eye that things are happening differently. We have occupation of non-integer momentum modes, and there's clearly evolution of the momentum distribution and the energy distribution as we go to the regime of large kick number. So how do we look at this quantitatively? Well, we can now just measure the energy as a function of kick number, and that's what's shown on this slide. So for the non-interacting data, these are the circles. We see this localization around an energy of 3 recoils in this case, and that goes up to very large kick numbers. Note that the x-axis here is logarithmic, so we go all the way from no kicks at the left to 1,000 kicks, almost at the right-hand side of the graph. If we turn on interactions, we see very different behavior. So we see still, for medium strength interactions, the squares, we see attainment of this plateau, which looks like it has a pre-thermal character. But then we see a divergence from the localization, from the localized plateau. And we see that delocalization, which occurs after hundreds of kicks, depends on the strength of interactions. So here, squares are medium interactions, about 2.5 rubidiums for those of you who are cold atomic physicists. And then the diamonds are stronger interactions where we've gone even closer to the Feshbach resonance. And you can see the delocalization depends on the interactions and is radically well distinguished from the localized case. I do want to point out, however, that although these energy growths here look steep compared to the non-interacting case, they're actually still noticeably subdiffusive for all the times we study, even up to these sort of 1,000 kick timescales. So what I've shown in the inset here on a log-log plot is a comparison between the pseudo-classical data I showed before with the random kicks, where we saw linear time energy growth. That's these triangles, and these are the theory lines for that. And then the interacting delocalization that we see after the pre-thermal plateau. And you can see that the slope is down by approximately a factor of 2. So the moral here is that even the interacting samples which delocalize, still absorb energy much more slowly than the classical kicked rotor that would be their counterpart. You can look at the destruction of localization in this system by tracking the momentum space distributions. This is, I mentioned earlier, it corresponds to Anderson localization in momentum space. And so you expect an exponentially suppressed occupation of higher momentum modes. And that's indeed what we see for non-interacting samples. So this is y-axis logarithmic on the right-hand side, the same data as in the left-hand column. So for non-interactions, we see this exponential envelope contains all the data. As we turn on interactions, you can see from the fact that the late time data, which is the purple line, rises above the exponential envelope more and more significantly for higher interactions. We can see that localization is no longer occurring in this system due to the interactions. And this deviation from the exponential momentum distribution actually turns out to be a pretty sensitive probe of localization. And that's what's shown on the right here, is how that deviation grows for interacting samples in a way that's sharply distinguished from non-interacting samples. So this is the end of the first part of my talk. And the main result here is that we've experimentally observed interaction-driven delocalization in a many-body quantum kicked rotor, a system that's been discussed a lot theoretically, but not studied experimentally before. And it opens a variety of potentially interesting avenues, we think. So one thing that we're looking at right now in the lab, actually we have some fun recent data, which I didn't have time to discuss here, is the dynamics of Low-Schmidt echoes in this system. So you can imagine there are ways to reverse the time evolution in a kicked rotor system like this. And that's the data that's shown here in the upper right is such a time reversal experiment where between kicks 5 and 6, we reverse the effective flow of time. I put as an inset this bicephalic mascot of our workshop here because I thought it kind of was related to these Low-Schmidt experiments. And of course, the really interesting question here is, how do the presence of many-body interactions affect the Low-Schmidt dynamics? So we see here for a non-interacting sample, pretty complete regaining of the zero mode after reversing the flow of time. But that changes if you introduce interactions, and that's something that we're being quantitative about now. I see another question in the chat about whether the condensate is in a trap. The condensate is not in a trap during these experiments. All the trapping potentials are turned off, so the condensate is just in free space in between kicks. These experiments are rather fast. They're all over in less than a millisecond, so gravity doesn't play much of a role here. A couple other good questions in the chat. What is the exponent of the subdiffusive behavior? It's in the neighborhood of 1/2. I wouldn't say that we have clearly distinguished, 0.5 from 0.7. It does depend on your fitting procedure a little bit, but that's something that we're talking. I mean, there have been interesting theoretical predictions of these subdiffusive exponents, and we're talking to people about that and would be excited to talk to more people if there's anyone who's interested. It's rather clearly distinguished from 1, I will say. It's kind of plainly subdiffusive. Yeah, and so there's some other interesting possibilities that are opened up here. Maybe the most important of which is this last bullet point, which is there's been a lot of theoretical work here. The correctness of a mean field treatment is a little bit in question. These are rather violent processes, redistributing momentum collisionally between rapidly moving atoms. It's not clear that mean field should really work here. So comparing these results to cutting edge theories is a really exciting possibility that's opened up here. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the quantum kicked rotor. So I want to now, in the last part of my talk, discuss a different experiment, but which is spiritually similar in that it's also an experiment on kicked quantum matter. So as I mentioned in response to Leo's question, the evolution between kicks in the quantum kicked rotor is sort of as simple as it could be. It's just free space dispersion, or maybe Bogolyubov at worst case. There's no position space structure at all during, no trap or anything during that evolution. You can ask, maybe it would be interesting to introduce richer possibilities. And one possibility is to have that evolution in between kicks take place in a lattice. So the dispersion is sort of controlled by the lattice. So this opens up the possibility of studying a kicked version of the well-known Aubrey-Andre Harper model. So this is basically a one-dimensional model of a quasicrystal, which consists of a strong tight binding-ish lattice with an incommensurate chemical potential perturbation provided by a secondary lattice. And this is really another system that's been very well used by atomic physicists to study Anderson-like localization transitions. So this is sort of a classic experiment in cold atomic physics. On the right here is data from my group, but this is something that other groups have done in the past, including, Ingusio, Aspe, and DeMarco. There was a lot of good study of localization type physics, some of which was using this, this incommensurate model. So here in the data on the right, you can see that as we increase the strength of the secondary lattice here, we have a transition from a delocalized condensate, which is spread out over a large area of real space, to a localized, sharply peaked density distribution. So there's been, and I put here at the lower right, just to show that this is an ongoing topic in cold atom physics, some recent, interesting recent paper also on the Aubrey-Andre-Harper model. It's not exactly what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is the kicked Aubrey-Andre-Harper model. So this is an ordinary lattice, which is almost always just a periodic lattice, but where we pulse the incommensurate perturbations. And so the question that this naturally raises is whether we can see a localization phase transition in a system which is almost always periodic, except during the kicks. And this is something that's been explored theoretically, including in the references shown at the lower right of this slide. And you can sort of calculate what you expect a phase diagram to look like as a function of the kick period, t, which is on the y-axis of these plots, and the pseudo-disorder strength, lambda, which is just the strength of this incommensurate perturbation. So the Hamiltonian is here. I observe a typo. One of these raising and lowering operators should be I plus 1. This is a tunneling term. But you basically have tunneling in the base lattice, and you have this pulsed incommensurate perturbation where alpha tells you the period ratio between the perturbing lattice and the main lattice. And what you generally expect is shown at left here. These are calculations done by my postdoc, Esat, which match well with published theory in the works I cite here. You expect a phase transition between a delocalized and a localized phase as a function of kick period and kick strength. And you expect the details of this to depend on alpha rather sensitively. So this animation at the right shows these kind of wild structures in the phase diagram that emerge at different values of alpha. I hope this is coming across okay on Zoom. So we went ahead and investigated this experimentally. And to make a long story short, we do observe this localization phase transition. So the experiment cartoon is shown at the right. This was actually done with a different atom in my group, strontium-84. We put it in a primary optical lattice and then periodically kicked with an incommensurate optical lattice in time, and then varied the kick period and the strength of the kicks to probe this localization phase transition. And so this color map here on the left shows a transition between the delocalized and localized phase, delocalized and localized in real space, about where you would expect. The dashed line is the theoretical prediction for where this should happen. So just to show what the data look like, I've sort of excerpted one line from this graph, and you can see that where the system is delocalized, we see that really means delocalized in position space. We see the atoms spread out. So this is a picture of atoms spreading out along the lattice direction after holding for 1 second in this kicked lattice. And then as we increase the strength of the pseudo-disorder lambda, we see that that spread out distribution transforms to a tight original BEC distribution that looks more like a localized state. So if we want to claim that we're really seeing a localization phase transition here, we thought it would be nice to be able to destroy localization and show that we're sort of seeing something non-trivial. So what we tried along these lines was to modulate the phasonic degree of freedom, which is the offset between the two lattices in this model. So we tried to see what would happen if we modulated this phasonic degree of freedom while we were in this kicked Aubrey-Andre-Harper model. And phasons are an interesting degree of freedom that only exist in quasicrystals, but I won't go into too much more about them now. So this is a cartoon of what we did. We just took the disordering lattice and moved it back and forth, and it was only on some of the time because this is a kicked model. And what we saw indeed was that the localization, so this top bar of data is the same data shown on the previous slide. You can see that as we increase the kick strength, the system localizes, but if we include the phasonic driving, that doesn't happen. You see this localization transition is kind of destroyed. But you might reasonably ask, are we just heating everything up? Are we just kind of destroying disorder? Because this is a very, destroying localization by heating. because this is a very sort of mean thing to do to a quasi-crystal, to change the Phason degree of freedom and kick at sort of quasi-random Phason displacements. Maybe we're just going to a high temperature. That turns out not to be the case, however. And when we tried increasing the amplitude of our phasonic driving, we saw something that was a little bit surprising to us. So what is shown here is this same position distribution I've been showing you as a function here, left to right, of increasing Phason drive amplitude. So weak amplitude on the left and strong amplitude on the right. And you can see that indeed you drive a transition from an apparently localized to delocalized phase as you increase the amplitude. But if you keep increasing it, you see this reentrant localization. And then the system actually oscillates back and forth between being localized and delocalized. So on the right, if you plot the position space width of the density distribution, you see these characteristic peaks, which don't depend on the drive frequency, that just happen at particular drive amplitudes. So this was surprising to us, and it's reasonable to ask what's going on here. And a conversation with Andre Eckart cleared this up for us. So you can notice, if you're a Bessel function fancier, that these peaks occur at the zeros of the first order Bessel function, around 2.4 and 5.5. And this can actually be understood as an effect of dynamical renormalization of the pseudo-disorder by this modulation. So this is uses the Jacobi-Enger expansion of this phasonically modulated lattice, which involves a Bessel function with this argument of the amplitude. And this exactly predicts that the effective, to first order, the effective quasi-disorder strength should go like this Bessel function and should go to 0 at these values plotted here with the dashed red lines. So we think that this really indicates that, and we observe no higher band population, by the way, so there's not significant heating here. So we think that what's going on here is we're using this modulation, dynamically renormalizing the pseudo-disorder and demonstrating coherent control of localization in this kicked quasi-crystal. So something to compare to here is the related but different physics of what happens when you phase modulate a single lattice and dynamically modify the tunneling, as was, I think, proposed by Martin Holthaus and collaborators originally, and then realized famously by the Florence group. So I think that's it for my time, and I want to just conclude here. So I hope I convinced you, although I think most participants of this workshop are already convinced, that kicked quantum matter is well suited for investigation with cold atoms and is a nice playground for studying dynamics, dissipation, thermalization, and many-body quantum mechanics. I told you about realizing an interacting quantum kicked rotor and looking at the physics of delocalization from a pre-thermal plateau driven by interactions. And then I talked about another kicked experiment looking at a pseudo-disorder driven localization phase transition and showed that we could exert coherent dynamical control of the transition by driving. So I want to close here by thanking the people who did all the work, some of whom are shown here and all of whom are listed here. I want to thank, of course, the funding agencies who supported the work and you for your attention.